Since the session is
Okay.
recorded, you can send it to them later.
All the students
Yeah.
here? Amen?
See, I mean,
Yeah.
what would you suggest? Start with students or we listen to you first?
Let's do it differently
See,
this
Amine.
time. If we can please go ahead and get started with the students, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Professor.
Okay, so Professor Slawi, the floor is yours to chair this seminar.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor KARFA. I'm glad to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Aminu Drury, and I would like also to greatly thank my colleague, Professor KARFA, for assigning me the task of chairing this session. I would like to warmly thank Professor Aminu Drury once again for accepting to give another lecture to our students and to entertain us with his own ideas and thoughts about language awareness and foreign language learning. We will give the floor first to our students to give their own presentation first, and then we have the debate, or we keep the debate till the end after Professor Amine deliver his own presentation. So the floor is yours. Iman, you say it's Ilham who is going to present.
Nope, it's Manal and Ayub.
So the floor is yours, Mr. Ayub and Manal. Okay, thank you.
I wish you the best of luck.
Yes, thank you, my friend, Iman. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Aminu Drury. It's a great pleasure for me to give you this presentation in front of all of you today. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank Professor KARFA for all his efforts, Professor Slawi, Professor Sidi, Professor Sedani, and all our dear professors attending with us today. My thanks also goes to Professor Aminu Drury for his very enlightening presentations that we benefit a lot from and we are so grateful for. Our presentation for today's webinar is going to be about language awareness, in which we are going to be discussing the following points. What is awareness? What is language awareness? The benefits of building language awareness in second language classrooms. What are the benefits of teaching and learning through another language or additional language? Common misconceptions about language awareness, the language profiles of learners, and language awareness in practice. As we all know, whenever the person is faced by a new concept, the first thing he or she will do is to look for its meaning and significance. That's why I will start with a small division and a definition of the two key words we have in our concept for today. We have awareness, which is the state or the ability to perceive, to feel, or to be conscious of events, objects, or sensory patterns. More broadly, it is the state or quality of being aware of something. In biological psychology, awareness is defined as humans or animals' perception and cognitive reaction to a condition or event. Going to the definition of language awareness, it was really hard for me to give just one unique definition, because going through the literature, you are going to find many experts talking about this concept, so I've chosen three definitions. The first one is given by Carter, 2003. explains that language awareness refers to the development in learners of enhanced consciousness of and sensitivity to the forms and functions of language. Berkeley 1992 states that language awareness is conscious attention to properties of language and language use as an element of language education. Verity 2003 defines language awareness as a subfield of applied linguistics and maintains that language awareness delves into the native speaker's knowledge to bring it into the surface, to make it conscious, to make it available tools to learners. A simple definition from all of these, we can say that language awareness is the good knowledge about language. It is a conscious understanding of how language works, of how people learn it and use it. Well, such definitions might provoke some questions regarding the role of language awareness. What is language awareness and what can it do for us? Does it better understanding of language helps to be a better language teacher or learner? Does higher degrees of awareness of language result in one's better relationship with the world around him? Those are the questions that we might ask ourselves. To answer them, and apart from the fact that everyone is a user of a language and language awareness is critical and crucial in people's life, language awareness is important in the concept of language, of foreign language learning and teaching. Since the concept of language awareness has attracted much attention since its inception, it has been the common belief that students can benefit from language awareness as stated by Ellis 2012, and that by getting insight from language awareness, students and specifically foreign language learners can critically get involved in foreign language skills. Such an understanding helps learners to be aware of the effect of language on human beings. They will be aware of what is thinkable, sayable, and doable. Furthermore, the implementation of language awareness in foreign language courses enriches learners' experiences and knowledge regarding the elements of language as well as the related culture. The personal exploration of the second language helps learners to find out how language works and thereby enriches and extends one's knowledge of the language by noticing and reflecting on the linguistic data all around them. There are other benefits by building language awareness in second language classrooms. We can help students gain a positive attitude towards the target language by developing the confidence to make an attempt or to take a risk. By becoming conscious of strategies that can be used to learn the second language, students might become more active and more responsible for their own learning. Becoming aware of the meaning of a language is part of language learning. By increasing students' language awareness, the students are better able to understand, appreciate, and use the language. We can see here that there are a lot of words that can give us the insight or that can we learn from that the students might use the language awareness to be autonomous and to be risk takers and to be active learners, to be motivated to learn and to know about the other culture. So now I will give the floor to my friend Ayub Gnawi. My colleague, please, would you start your part, and best of luck, and wish that you are benefiting from our presentation, and thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you so much, dear Manal. Now I will move to my part. So, what are the benefits of teaching and learning through an additional language? Teaching and learning through an additional language encourages understanding between culture, improves students' cognitive ability, and prepares them for life beyond school. The existence of more than one language in the brain leads to improved cognitive control. This has a positive effect on working memory, selective attention, and processing information. All these skills are very important in students' way of seeing and learning, and also the mental flexibility. So the common misconceptions about language awareness, we heard that fluency in conversational language means fluency in academic language. Many teachers are surprised when they receive a piece of written work that suggests a student who has no difficulties in everyday communication has problems understanding the main ideas of a lesson. Problems arise when teachers assume that students who have attained a high degree of fluency and accuracy in everyday social English have a corresponding level of academic proficiency. Whether English is a student's first language or an additional language, they need time, of course, and the appropriate support to become competent in academic language, as it is that language they will mostly need in school. The language profile of different learners. To better understand individual student language performance, to find out the answer, we should find out and answer the following questions. How many learners in your class are first language users of English? So to identify the language profiles of students, how many learners in your class are not first language users of English? When and where did these students begin to learn English? For example, at home, or with their friends, or at secondary school, primary school, which other languages play a central role in the lives of your learners. Many learners have Tamazighs are their first language, and so they face difficulties through language learning and when adding multiple languages in their brain. Which languages do your learners use at home? Other than English, which languages do your learners read and write in? The ability to focus on multiple languages at the same time. Now we move to language awareness in practice in classrooms. So first, the context. A teacher who is a language aware thinks about the school setting and circumstances and the language profiles of their learners, as we mentioned. So that is their different levels of competence. You need to have, as a teacher, a good understanding of your learners' language experiences, both in and out of school, which is very crucial. This helps you to plan the best way to support their continued learning and set realistic targets and challenges for them. The planning of the lesson. Once you have a clear understanding of your learner language profiles, this will help you to build language support into your lesson planning. For many teachers, this means designing the various steps of the lesson in a way that will achieve the lesson content, aims, and objectives, and then reviewing the lesson plan with a specific focus on the academic language. The lesson may differ from the conversational skills and so on, but when you come back into the planning, a teacher that has a language awareness may focus more on the academic language used during the class. Learning objectives for content and language should be clearly set out alongside each other. Moving on to the teaching process, as well as carefully consider the language demands of your lesson. At the planning stage, you should take extra steps during the lesson to be sensitive to the potential language needs of your learners. This technique might include, as a teacher, thinking out loud and describing what you're doing using body language and gestures, adding visual or diagram supports, and repeating or saying something in a different way using specific examples from maybe cultural examples or situational examples. It is important to give learners time to process information and respond when you're asking them a question. Many teachers already use some of these techniques, of course, but deliberately focusing on them can result in a more planned approach to language awareness. Of course. So moving on to the assessment. Based on the learning objectives, it is important to plan assessment opportunities to assess your students, to provide useful feedback on the learning process. Assessment outcomes need to be clearly linked to learning objectives, and students need to understand the assessment criteria, of course, and what success in a particular task or assignment looks like. Giving students feedback on their language as well as their understanding of a certain subject, this sends a message to students about the value of the language as a tool to communicate their ideas and also make sure that language learning progresses. So the students develops his ideas and information about the subject, but at the same time, he practices his language and he is aware of the language he uses. How am I going to include language support in my lesson planning? It is through language that learners access the contents, of course, of the lesson and communicate their ideas. As a result, language is something that all teachers need to think about at the level of the lesson planning and preparation stage. It is important to design a lesson that will achieve the content aims at first, and then to go back and review each certain stage of your lesson and the activities you have planned, but with a more focus on the language used. What can be achieved through language awareness work? What is the result of all such practices inside your classroom is that language classes become more educational. Learners develop the capacity to think critically about language. In a side and the other side, they will have also more information about the subject tackled and about the target culture you may be referring to. Here's the references. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it was very beneficial for all of you. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ayub and Ms. Manal, for your informative presentation, which surely will raise a lot of questions among your classmates and the audience. Okay, so Professor KARFA, do you suggest to open the door for the floor for discussion, or shall we move on to the our professors and guest speaker, Professor Aminu Drury? Then we can have a general discussion. What do you suggest? Shall we have a brief discussion of the students' presentation, then have a talk? Professor Drury's lecture. What do you suggest?
I mean, what do you suggest?
Sorry, Professor, I can't hear you.
Yeah. Yes, I mean.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what do you suggest? We open the floor for some questions, then we listen to you, or we make it a global debate by the end of the...
Whatever
you
works
think?
for you is fine with me. I believe it would not hurt to highlight a few important points from the presentation first. That way we can at least help put everybody in context, which will also be a great precursor to my presentation, if that's not going to take up a lot of time. I just wanted to highlight myself a few points from the presentation. I would like to first of all congratulate Manal and Ayub on an outstanding presentation. Very concise, self-explanatory. A few things that you raised that stood out to me, specifically from the presentation, is learning through an additional language, or focusing on multiple languages at the same time. Although my presentation today will not be conducted from that perspective, and what I mean by that perspective, I mean learning through additional languages. I will nonetheless highlight specific learning mechanisms that students can develop to not just learn English, but keep learning English, keep learning it. And of course, lifelong learning is one keyword that comes to mind when we hear that. Being aware of something is important. When we learn a language, are we aware of what we're learning? We know that we're learning words, uttering words, speaking words. Do we know what those words really mean? Do we know how specific sentence constructions or why certain sentences are constructed the way that they are? How languages work is the ultimate purpose, of course, behind language awareness. There's a difference between two people. The first one driving a car. He or she is a very good driver and has no problems, no traffic violations. Person number two drives as well as person number one, but person number two has a deeper understanding of of what happens inside the car, how the car moves, and when you hit the gas pedal, what happens inside with the engine, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, that's what we want to develop in our students, is the ability to not just speak the language, but also understand how the language works. How do people learn language is another question that was raised in the presentation. How do we learn that language? More importantly, one of the objectives of language awareness, as was highlighted by our dear students today, is developing the confidence to learn and to take risks. Risk taking is very important. Being autonomous is another keyword in the presentation. Now, we teach our students the language inside the classroom. We need to make sure that they are able to not only use the language outside of the classroom, but that they're also able to keep developing their language as they practice it. Preparing students for life outside of the classroom or beyond school. And I am also glad that focus has not been given just to students in terms of language awareness, but also to teachers. And today I'll talk about trainee teachers and how to prepare them for life inside the classroom. How do we prepare our trainee teachers to excel in the classroom? Not just teach, but excel. Not just deliver content, but inspire those learners to, of course, keep learning beyond the classroom. Teachers who are language aware, I love the way that you put it. By the same token, of course, we would like to make sure that teachers are not just, now what inspires good teaching? What inspires quality, cutting edge teaching? It's how we design those lessons and develop those lesson plans. And that's very important. And of course, there's not just the pre and during, there's also the post, right? Reviewing lesson plans as we go along the road. We make the necessary revisions and additions, of course, based on arising needs of students, of course. Finally, using cultural or situational examples. And I personally believe, and I'm going to mention it here today in a little bit, that the best way, at least from personal experience, the best way to teach or to teach something as a teacher or to understand something as a student is through examples. Helping put those students in context, helping put our trainee teachers in context, of course, is very important. This is everything that I wanted to highlight in terms of important points that were raised in the presentation. If you would like to go ahead and move on, if you would like us to go ahead and move on to my presentation, I would be more than happy to do it. But I would like to, before we do that, if possible, open the floor for either additional comments or questions, either from our students or from anybody who is present here today.
Thank you very much, Professor OUDGHIRI, for your insightful clarifications and explanations. So we give the floor now to the students and to the audience to ask questions and to address questions or comments or whatever to the two presenters. So the floor is to you, dear audience.
Okay, so may I speak?
Yes, Amine?
Okay, so thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I actually have one question. So what do you think are some of the activities that professors can implement in their classes which may serve to raise language awareness for students?
Yeah,
Yes,
good question.
that's my question. Thank you.
Any other question, please? And then by the end, the two presenters can react to all of these questions. Ayub?
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes?
Could you hear me, please?
Yes, sir. We
I am Abderrahim. I am a PhD candidate.
Yes.
You are my supervisee, Professor. Big hi to all of you, our great professors, and dear mates, and also the special hi to special regards to the students of the master program. I'm just one. I would like also to thank the presenters for such insightful points. Just one point that I would like to raise about language awareness is the point of culture and socio-pragmatics, and how the second language teaching and learning can be interfered with these two binary positions or binary factors in teaching and learning. And thank you so much. So I would like to raise this issue, and how can they be tackled in this this presentation today? Thanks a lot.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Yeah. Yes, Ahmed. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, Professor.
Yes.
Yes, sometimes we find that students use their language and teachers use theirs. So how can teachers overcome this gap or bridge between conversational language and academic language? Thank you.
Something that I will discuss today, but I will let everybody chime in if you would like.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor OUDGHIRI.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
I want to ask a question. You mentioned in his part that with the learners have different levels of competence, and the teacher's role is to understand students' experiences both in and out of school. So how can we have a good understanding of our students' language experiences both in and out of school?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Could you please react to these questions? Then we can take other questions if possible. You?
Yeah, Professor Slawi.
Yes. I suggest
Yes,
that they
yeah,
can
just
questions.
okay.
And then we can have others. What do you think, Professor? Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Ayub?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Can you react to your friend's questions and to the other students' questions?
Okay, so for the question of Ahmed Kahim about the conversational language and the academic language, we see that the fluency cannot be assessed on conversational language only, but also on the academic language. So we cannot identify the level of a certain students on only how he pronounces, on how he uses a language, but also through writing works and exams and so on. So what I said in the presentation is that the fluency can never define the level of a certain student. And moving on to the question of Insaf Khudri about the teacher determining the different level of competences of students and how the language can be used in and out of the classrooms. So for example, you may find like students capable of using their additional language, maybe French or English, in a very spontaneous way due to their family competence, like they speak a lot at home or with friends. So here we can add the family and add the environments of the students in the context of language learning and language awareness. So it's in the classroom and outside the classroom. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, you. Yes. What
Yes,
about
Professor.
Manal? Can you
To react, yes, to react about my friend Iman's questions, which was what should teachers do to raise the learning awareness for students? Well, I think that teachers should give students tasks that may allow them to apply metacognitive strategies that will help them transfer knowledge into new contexts. That's really a good strategy to be done by teachers to raise the language awareness for their students. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Professor KARFA, the floor is yours. You wanted to intervene?
Yeah, just a brief remark about the presentation. First, once again, I would like to thank Professor Aminu Drury for his efforts for joining us today. We have been waiting for him the whole week, everybody. So thank you very much. I would like to thank some of our colleagues who have joined us. I have Professor Azlara Benani from the Department of Philosophy, the Faculty of Letters and Human Sciences, Darmeres. Our friend, President of the local branch of MATE, C. Ardwan Miliani, C. Fuad Boulaid, and our colleague and friend Karima Belghaiti. Professor Adiba Bousfiha, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Adiba, and I think she doesn't know. Yeah, she doesn't know Professor Adiba. That Professor Udghiri studied in Urat, the Faculty of Science. My friend Professor Ordu, Professor Karoum Fatim Zara, and C. Saadin Akhjam, and C. Yusuf Tamer from Professor Yusuf Tamer from Ibn Zohar University.
Professor bin Abderrazak.
Professor bin Abderrazak, my friend and colleague, C. bin Abderrazak. Professor Naima Tahiri from the Department of German Studies, the Faculty of Letters and Human Sciences. Thank you all. I will update the list. Just one brief remark about the presentation. Yes, thank you. Congratulations, dear students, for this interesting presentation. I have an advice. I think students need to do more readings about language awareness. Language awareness, because the two words making up language awareness may mean many things to many people, and they seem to be, particularly the word awareness, it seems to be self-explanatory, which is not the case. I would advise my students to read a book written by Leo van Lier, published in 1996, on the entitled Interaction in the Language Curriculum, Awareness, Autonomy, and Authenticity, especially chapter 4, in which Van Leer presents a very concise, well-articulated overview of different perspectives on language awareness and different concepts and terms that have been used interchangeably with language awareness. And more importantly, Van Leer suggests a number of practical implications for first teachers training, and then classroom activities and patterns of communication. And he overviews a number of perspectives: performance perspective, cognitive, social, affective, a number of perspectives well articulated, and of course a brief history of language awareness since 1937. An article was published by a Danish researcher in which he talked about language understanding, and he presented two perspectives. One is related to intuition, the other one to reflection. And he compared language awareness, language understanding, with language feeling. Then the emergence of language awareness movement in the 1970s, and particularly in Great Britain, later on in US, in Europe, okay? And now it has emerged as an important issue, and it is widely debated. An essential part of this debate seems to be a new attempt to refocus on language rather than on communication, on language as a structure, on language as culture, on the mechanisms underlying language and mechanisms through which language works. So I think my students may need to do some more readings because they are prepared to conduct research, maybe in 1 year or 2 years. So I would advise them to do more readings on the literature on language awareness. Awareness does not mean consciousness. Language awareness is discussed and debated with respect to the mother tongue, as well as to second language and foreign language. It is not related only to the mother tongue. Okay, so issues related to or involved in language awareness are a bit complex. They are not easy, and there are so many definitions and so many terms, such as knowledge about language awareness, and the issues involved are closely related to what we mean by language knowledge or knowledge about language. Okay, so maybe we didn't have time, because we suddenly found ourselves at home. So I didn't give my students enough readings, because the readings I have are hard copies. So there was no way to give them these hard copies. Yes, I have some very interesting readings on language awareness. I hope we can do it next year, the first semester, when we meet. See, I mean, thank you very much. The floor is yours. I think it will certainly cover a number of issues on language awareness.
Professor,
yeah.
Allow me to introduce once again Professor OUDGHIRI, because we have new participants who have just joined us. I would have the pleasure to introduce him once again to those participants. Then we give him the floor to give his presentation, if you don't mind, Professor. Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Professor, we are also once again glad to welcome our distinguished colleague, Professor Aminu Drury. He is faculty member of the Department of English, Marshall University. He teaches business English and science and technological writing. His major areas of specializations are writing across the disciplines, systematic functional linguistics, and leadership studies. He is a former faculty senator of Marshall University and currently serves as the Advisory Council of Faculty, a representative before Marshall's Faculty Senate, part of the Higher Education Policy Commission, and also he is a former vice president and president of West Virginia TESOL, and currently serves as the policy and advocacy chair of West Virginia TESOL. He also participated as an affiliate representative of West Virginia TESOL in the International TESOL Conference of Toronto, Canada 2015, and Seattle, Washington, USA 2017. He participated in the 2014 Advocacy and Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. as a higher education representative. He presented at the following major conferences: West Virginia TESOL, Ohio TESOL, Virginia TESOL, and Arizona TESOL, Connecticut TESOL, and California, Nevada TESOL. As a participant in Washington's Advocacy and Policy Summit, his job is to work with his state senator and congressional representatives in Washington on ways to direct the appropriate funds to developing and sustaining English language programs in West Virginia as part of his leadership academic service. He plans to participate in this year's June 2020 Advocacy and Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. as West Virginia TESOL's advocacy. We are happy to have you today with us and to entertain us about the subject of language awareness in foreign language learning. Thank you very much, dear Professor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Slewi. I couldn't have imagined such a beautiful introduction. I would like to also start, as always, by thanking our talented, our one and only Professor KARFA for bringing everyone together once again and allowing us to learn from each other. This is a great opportunity. These webinars are extremely important because they're an opportunity for our students to hone or reinforce, develop their research inquiry skills. I also see these webinars as an opportunity for faculty members to join efforts in furthering research in specific areas of interest, as well as contributing to important research conversations. And that's the beauty of research. It's ongoing. It's never ending. Quality research requires that we keep asking questions, that we keep reflecting on current research practices. And then I believe personally that these webinars are the perfect venue to do it. So once again, thank you so much, Professor KARFA, for this great initiative. I would also like to thank our dear students today, our dear professors who are present today. Professor Ben Abderrahim, I don't know if he remembers me. I was in one of your introductory courses to linguistics 17 years ago, back in 2003. I feel old right now. And I also remember being in one of your CIR classes, Composition and Introduction to Research. I would like to thank you for everything that you, all the instruction, invaluable instruction. And thank you so much, more importantly, for being here today. I would like to go ahead and share my screen here. I hope that I am able to do that. Let's see. It'll take me a second here. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint right now?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yes, you can do so.
So today's presentation is language awareness in foreign language teaching. And I would like once again to thank Ayub and Manal for putting us in context. You touched on important principles of language awareness, and I hope that through my presentation today I can kind of supplement some of those points. I have an outline here, a presentation outline that I'd like to share first before I start. I'd like to start with a brief introduction, and like last time, if you ask my students here, they will tell you that I love to start with reflection questions. Reflection questions are not only reflection questions, but they're also guiding questions. They can help put everybody in context. What is the current conversation? What's the conversation right now? What is it that needs further development, for example? These research questions could also serve as topics for master's theses or PhD dissertations. I would like to go over an extended definition beyond the one that our students provided today, principles and objectives, applications of language awareness as it applies to both our students and our trainee teachers, and finally, a final reflection. To begin with, I would like to start by sharing the sentiment of a number of researchers in the field. Like Professor KARFA echoed earlier today, the sentiment is language awareness, as important as it is, has quote unquote, to some degree, remained on the periphery of mainstream practices in language teaching and teacher education. In other words, not so much attention has been afforded this important area of research. I personally believe that there's so much potential in language awareness that we are either oblivious to or ignorant of. So once again, like last time, here are a few guiding reflection questions for today's presentation purposes. Can we talk about language awareness in terms of both theory and practice? We know theory and practice, of course, complement each other in formulating solid and successful pedagogies. What possible connections can we draw between language awareness and current theories of language teaching and learning? In other words, how can language awareness both inform and put current theories to work in the service of both student programs and teacher education programs? What is the relationship between language awareness and critical social Dimensions. A keyword here is critical social dimensions. In other words, can we position language awareness within a context that is purely social? If so, what are a few pedagogical benefits of this move, and what does that even mean? I hope everyone remembers from my last presentation when we discussed the different meanings of the word culture. There's the, on the one hand, this conventional orthodox definition of culture as it relates to concepts of society, heritage, so on and so forth. But we also have, on the other hand, the other meaning of culture as reflecting the different ways that we approach teaching and learning. Now, similar to culture, society may also be understood and approached from both a conventional, if you will, a conventional and practical lens. Now, scouring for a clear and concise definition of language awareness, I found one that I wanted to share with everyone today, and the definition is as follows. Language awareness is a mental attribute which develops through paying motivated attention to language in use and which enables language learners to gradually gain insights into how languages work. It is also a pedagogic approach that aims to help learners to gain such insights. Now, unlike last time, I would like to engage my audience here today in the presentation, please, if you don't mind. So I'm going to ask you first to help me, if you don't mind, highlight a few key words from this important definition. Can someone help me identify one or more keywords from this definition?
Yes, sir. Can I speak?
Go ahead.
Yes. Here, I think what's really striking here is the relation that exists between language awareness and pedagogy.
Good. Okay. Now, give me just words. Give me just keywords.
So I would say pedagogy.
Pedagogy. Very good. Yeah. What else?
Sir,
can I speak?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Mental attribute.
Mental attribute. Thank you. What else?
Sir?
Motivated.
Motivated.
Motivated attention. Yes. What else?
Language in use.
Language in use. Very good. And I have highlighted. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Pedagogic approach.
Yes, pedagogic approach. I have highlighted those words here. Keywords today that I would like to focus on, and of course, we'll keep referring back to these keywords as we move along the road. Mental attribute, motivated attention, how languages work, and pedagogic approach. Now, among others, we understand from this definition that language awareness is an approach to language teaching. We also understand that an important attribute, if you will, or feature of language awareness is that teachers, quote unquote, discover language for themselves. What does that mean? We'll come back to it, of course, but in other words, just for clarification purposes, through language awareness, English language learners are encouraged to not just learn or acquire the language, but also constantly reflect on the language on the go. They reflect as they go. Hawkins, 1984, admits as well that language awareness, in fact, involves challenging learners to, quote unquote, ask questions about language and gather their own data from the world outside of school, something that was mentioned in our students' presentation today. Others also see language awareness as helping to develop a, quote, healthy spirit of inquiry, which in turn boosts or encourages, of course, consensus building through discussion and negotiation. When by consensus, I mean coming to terms or to a unanimous agreement on how learning and teaching ought to be conducted. what this means, at least to me, is we can employ language awareness in the service of our students in a way that turns them into inquisitive or curious learners. Or in other words, learners who are constantly willing to search and explore what I like to call uncharted territory, or territory that has not been discovered, or at least that is a bit underdeveloped. Or the learner, in other words, paying close and conscious attention to not just the use of language, but also the structure. So both the structure and the use of the language. So once again, if any of us teachers here today are wondering about or looking for a good way to instill a sense of discovery in our students, language awareness, I believe, is the way to go. So here, just before we dig a little deeper into language awareness, it's important first to know what language awareness is not. Now, we may know what it is, but what language awareness is not is also important. It's important to distinguish between a traditional top-down teaching approach through which teachers deliver explicit content to the learner, and a language awareness approach which calls for, let's say, a reconsideration, if you will, or reevaluation of this top-down delivery of content. In other words, from a language awareness perspective, teaching, at least from what I see, from my own experience in the classroom, I believe, and I may be wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong, teaching should not be restricted only to top-down modes of delivery. How about bottom-up modes of delivery? Or in other words, equipping our students with the apparatus necessary to reach that, what I like to call the aha moment, right, by themselves. Or to say it differently, language awareness is not normally taught by the teacher or found in a particular textbook. It's not like a teaching method, if you will, like grammar, translation, or the communicative method. It's rather developed by the learner himself or herself. Now to some principles and objectives. And of course, please, along the road, I'd like you to please remember two things. Number one, I would love to engage you in the conversation. Number two, please, if you would like, you could judge. If you have questions about them later, we can discuss them together. Now that we have defined language awareness, what are a few basic principles of language awareness? One principle is learners are more likely to learn when they are affectively engaged. This is a word that Professor KARFA mentioned earlier today, affection. Learners are affectively engaged, which means being emotionally attached to the language material, being emotionally attached. We talk about being in a classroom where we love the content as students. We love the content, we love the professor, we're really engaged. But can we also talk about being in a classroom where the general atmosphere, at least the physical one, does not matter as much as, let's say, our own love for that content? A keyword here is affectively, which means, once again, being emotionally attached to the language materials. In other words, the students can relate to or identify with the language, and they can also develop a certain level of ease and comfort in working with the language material. Another principle is when learners are given the opportunity to pay deliberate attention to specific features of language use, they can then, in turn, start developing those proper mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, or what some researchers call the psychological readiness. that will allow them to notice the disparity or the gap. And I believe I heard someone mention the word gap, the gap between at least conversational and academic language. I believe that was a question that was asked of our presenters today. Now, these mechanisms, once again, will allow them to notice the disparity or the gap between their own performance as non-native speakers and the performance, of more proficient or native speakers of English. How can we reach that level of excellence, in other words? What this also means is language awareness is a tool that would actually allow our students to be constantly thinking and reflecting about their use of the language. Not just using it, but reflecting about the use of that language. And I remember when I was little, the reason I'm so attached to the English language right now is I remember when I was little, I was always reflecting on, at 5, 6, 7 years old, I remember really well reflecting on certain words in the Arabic language, for example, and analyzing them, which actually helped me develop this love for languages in general. Questions our students might be asking along the road are, how am I using English? Why is it that the more proficient speakers or native speakers of English are using the language differently? What is it that I can do to reach that level of proficiency? And so through observation and critical analysis, our students can engage, if you will, in a never-ending process of trial and error, which is fine. I know this sounds a little bit intimidating at this stage or not so practical, trial and error. As long as they're thinking about the language critically, especially in terms of how they can use that language in specific contexts, I believe that should not be viewed as an issue. Now, because after all, English should not be taught from one lens. If you remember me last time speaking about the need to approach the teaching of English from different lenses, or my two terms that I introduced last time, macro Englishes and micro Englishes. Now that's why a subfield of language awareness exists, which is known as CLA, or critical language awareness, which is the same approach, except that it focuses on the, if you will, the relationship between language and social context. Once again, it's one macro English, right? But depending on the specific social context, a specific micro English emerges and, of course, imposes itself. We can't help it. Now, so far, we've briefly touched on two principles of language awareness. Now, let's discuss the primary objective of language awareness. One prime objective, as you can see on your screen, of language awareness is to help learners to notice for themselves how language is typically used. Now, this is where our students combine in-class learning with out-of-class lifelong learning. And this is a testament, of course, to the importance of lifelong learning as echoed by Professor KARFA in a previous presentation. Now, another important reflection question begs itself. What pedagogical procedures can we put in place that can help maximize interactive collaboration between, number one, the learner and other learners, number two, the learners and the teacher-learner interaction, and number three, the learners and proficient users of language, of the language, sorry. And this is where the out-of-class experience, of course, comes into play. A few applications of language awareness now, always as part of the prime objective of language awareness. And to go back to CLA, or critical language awareness, just for a brief moment, through CLA, learners, English language learners, learn about the socio-political factors that have shaped specific uses of English in different contexts. What does that mean? In other words, students are, if you will, pushed to explore why these different micro-Englishes, once again, these are my words, have come to be the way that they are. As Tomlinson 2003 puts it, language use has consequences for identity. In other words, learners may have certain socio-political reasons for choosing one version of the language as opposed to another. Now, I know this is pretty abstract, so as I mentioned earlier, for clarification and elaboration or illustration purposes, let's examine a few examples. I personally believe that the shortcut to understanding any complex concept is through examples. Examples are magic. More importantly, I would also like to engage everyone here on Zoom and on Facebook Live in the examination and discussion of these examples. Let's take, for instance, active versus passive voice. Now, I'm using active versus passive voice as just a small example in the plethora of examples that we have out there. I do not doubt that everyone here present today is familiar with the structure and construction of the active and passive voice sentences. But the question is, do we teach our students the purpose and use of these two important sentence structures based on context? If so, how do we do it? Can our discussion of language awareness today offer us, if you will, hints as to how context-based teaching, as informed by language awareness, can be conducted? Now to our examples. Let's examine, for instance, the following two sentences, and these are my own sentences. And the thing about these sentences is they have not been inspired by research, but rather by my own experience teaching ESL back in the days, as well as my own personal investigation, if you will, of how language works through the use of specific sentence structures. You see how I'm applying language awareness to my experience right now? The two sentences are, and I would like for everybody here to please look at these two sentences for me and let's analyze them together. The first one is: a law-abiding pedestrian was hit by a reckless driver. The second sentence is: a reckless driver hit a law-abiding pedestrian. I kindly invite everyone present here today to help me examine these two sentences carefully, at least at a surface level, reading, if you will, of both sentences reveals that we have what? We have a situation where a pedestrian was crossing the road the way that he or she's supposed to, right? And that a driver who was not paying enough attention inflicted some sort of injury, if you will, on this pedestrian. Now, to my first question, this is an easy question. Which one of these two sentences is the active voice construction and which one is the passive voice construction?
Yes, can I answer?
The second one is active.
The second one is active, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The first one is passive.
Yes.
Why is it that the first sentence is a passive voice construction? We're now, please remember, we're doing it now surface level, right? We're just looking at the structure. Huh?
Because of the agent, because the agent is mentioned in the active voice, it is topicalized.
Okay, very good.
In the second one, in the first one, it is at the end of the sentence.
Yes, 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 very good. Now we know that right now the first sentence is a passive voice construction because the subject is not the instigator of the action, right? But rather the one that is affected by the action. By the same token, we also have an agent, as you mentioned earlier, who is a reckless driver. And the position of this agent is the end of the sentence. In this case, the agent is the real instigator of the action, but is not given subject position, right? He or she is given agent position. We also know that the second sentence is an active voice construction because the instigator of the action, or a reckless driver, is given subject position, right? And unlike the passive voice construction, the person who is affected by the action or a law-abiding citizen is given object position. So you see, this is great. So now we know, I don't doubt our students in the classroom. I'm not really worried about them doing a bad job, especially after much practice in terms of putting together solid active versus passive voice sentences. I don't have a doubt about that. So we teach students once again how to structure each voice construction. And we say, you know, that they're free to use either one as they please or as they see fit, right? Or at least vary their use of active versus passive construction just to make their conversation or writing more interesting. However, here's the catch-22, or in other words, here's the trick. During my first years of graduate and postgraduate work here in the US, I came to learn that many professors ask their students to not use the passive voice, right? That is, they encourage, let's say, active voice construction in writing academic essays and dissertations. And this is one of my areas of specialization, is writing across the disciplines, and I can identify a lot with this. So I'm happy that I get to talk about it today. Now, however, other professors absolutely want to see a lot of passive voice structures in their students' writing for reasons that I initially ignored, but that, you know, along the road I came to understand through through textbook reading, through my own investigation of the different uses of language, especially in context. Now, to my second, more in-depth question, and once again, I'd like to kindly invite the audience. Does anyone here see some sort of ideology, if you will, permeating the structure of each sentence? In other words, what does the first sentence, the passive voice construction, really mean? What does the second sentence, the active voice construction, really mean? Now, we all agree they're written in the same language, right? English. But can we talk about a possible ideology embedded in each sentence? Can someone here throw a quick guess for me?
Yes, probably in the first sentence, we have the focus is put on the action rather than the actor.
Okay.
I think also because of the mindset.
The mindset. What do you mean by mindset? Tell me a little more about that, please.
I mean, for the first one, for example, we like to blame. We like people, they like to put the blame on the external factors. Whereas in the second one, which is active, the people, they like to put the blame on the person itself. It's also cultural. It's cultural because it's a question of internal locus of control or external locus of control.
A keyword there is blame. Very good.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. I love the way you put it. Anybody else? Now, just to put these two sentences in, let's say, a possible context, right? And the answers to my question were great. Let's, for instance, just for illustration purposes, if you will, let's picture two news stations. News station number 1 and news station number 2. Let's say news station number 1 reports the news using, if you will, the passive voice structure. A law-abiding pedestrian was hit by a reckless driver. What does this say about news station number 1? Can we guess? Maybe you've already provided the answer to it, but can we, now that we have a specific context?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I can say that it's a bit biased because he is given some judgments.
Okay.
We have the word reckless, which means that he gives some judgment on that.
Sure.
And that you have a violation. For example, here we have a violation because the reckless driver, he has commit something which is forbidden.
Okay. Very good. Now we can say that news station 1, let's say, gives priority or more importance to sympathizing with the law-abiding citizen, right? This passive voice construction also suggests that news station 1 is not necessarily, and I say necessarily, is not necessarily concerned or interested in blaming the reckless driver. Now, just to mention here before we move on to the next, to news station 1, the word reckless also exists in the active voice structure. So it's not a matter of that. Maybe a reckless kind of adds some sort of perspective to the sentence, and I agree with that. Now, do we see an ideology here so far? We're moving along. Also, let's say news station 2 adopts or uses the active voice construction. A reckless driver hit a law-abiding pedestrian, and it's reporting of the exact same traffic incident. It's the exact same traffic incident. What does this sentence say about news station number 2? Can we guess?
I think here we want to focus on blaming the driver.
Okay, yes, absolutely. It's clear. Unlike news station number 1, we can say that news station number 2 gives priority to blaming the reckless driver, right? At least at this stage, news station 2 is not interested in sympathizing with the law-abiding pedestrian. Can we also talk about let's say an underlying ideology pertaining to news station number 2? I think we can.
Yes.
Now we come to the important part. What can we learn from this example? Now, how does this all play out in terms of, connecting the dots in terms of language awareness? First, we learned that in the case of news reporting, right, we cannot possibly talk about one uniform way of reporting, right? One generalized or universal way of reporting. Can we agree that different news stations have specific ideological or political motives for reporting the news the way that they do? I believe we can say that. We also see that learners learn best when they're given the opportunity to reflect on the language beyond just that explicit instruction that we deliver in the classroom. Here's active, here's passive. But the student at the end of the day is asking, so what, right? So if they ask so what and they don't have a satisfactory answer to that question, we are in trouble. Now, that way, when we or when the students say are exploring the language via other means, especially in contexts outside of the classroom, they know what the language means or what it entails in that specific context. And that's how they start to develop that affective, if you will, attachment to language. More importantly, this active and passive voice sentence structure differentiation, if you will, or the lesson itself can teach our students to what? To not be passive recipients of the news, right? These examples can teach them careful and critical examination of the news, which in turn will help them become more socially and politically informed. We talk about responsible citizens. What does it mean to be a responsible citizen, right? And here we can go back to our earlier discussion about learners having certain socio-political reasons for preferring or using certain structures of English over others, thanks to language awareness. Clear so far?
Yes, sir.
Now we're starting to hopefully connect the dots, aren't we? Right? And of course, I'll be happy to take questions and or entertain discussions at the end of the of the presentation. Now, here are two additional scenarios for our consideration today. These two scenarios also involve active and passive voice construction. Let's take two examples. The first one is technical support for computers, and the second one is letters of recommendation as two additional examples. In the case of technical support, let's say there's a glitch or a problem, software or hardware problem in your computer, right? And you take it to the you take the computer to a computer store or a computer shop to be fixed. Okay, so you expect the shop. Here we have a place in the US called Best Buy. Best Buy and is an electronics place where you can go and buy things, but they also have a section there called Geek Squad where you can take your computer to be fixed, and they call you when the computer is fixed. So you expect the shop, once again, to give you a call, right, when your computer is ready. Now, as a customer, here's the interesting part. Which one of these two sentences would you, as a customer, want to hear the technician on the phone say? Which one of these two sentences would you like to hear from the technician? Let's say you are Mrs. Brown, okay? Would you like to hear the technician say, Mrs. Brown, your computer has been fixed? Or, Mrs. Brown, John Smith fixed your computer?
The first one.
Your computer has been fixed.
The first one.
Why?
We don't care about.
We don't care who fixes it.
Exactly.
We're not interested in.
Yes.
Exactly. As a customer, do you really care who fixed your computer? No.
No.
Now, what is your priority as a customer? To know, of course, that your computer has been fixed and is ready for pickup, or you don't really care who fixed your computer. Of course, that is that the computer has been fixed is what you want to hear. As long as it's ready for pickup, you don't really care who fixed it, and you don't need to know who fixed it, do you? Right? No, we don't need to do that. We don't need to know that. Sorry. All you need to know is that your computer is back to normal, which is originally the purpose behind taking the computer to the computer shop in the first place. Now, in the case of computer service support, and this is an area of writing, I teach technical writing, right? Technical, scientific and technical writing. Customer support is part of it in the case of customer support, customer service support. Which structure can we expect to find the most of in technical support? Active voice or passive voice?
Active.
I think it's passive voice. Passive voice.
Passive voice. Okay. Yes. Your computer has been fixed. That's passive voice, right? Now that's why we have your computer, not John Smith, right, in the subject position. Now, this illustration of customer service support is a great example of teaching our students the specific micro English that is relevant to their particular area of life or field of study or expertise. So instead of merely just warning, right, our students against the use of active or passive voice, we should encourage them to consider incorporating the important element of what? Of context, right, in their learning of English. Context is important. At the end of the day, many students are left wondering why their teacher is asking them to not use the passive voice or to consider heavy use of the active voice. Why? A lot of us actually fail to do that, unfortunately. The final example is a scenario where a student is asking the teacher, his or her teacher, to write him or her a letter of recommendation. I'm taking it today that our professors present here may have already written a few letters of recommendation, right? And I also know that some of our students today have either already asked for a letter of recommendation or need one for a job or for admission into a postgraduate degree, for example. Now, back to the letter of recommendation example. In this letter of recommendation, which one of the following sentences would you see plenty of? Which one of these sentences would you, as a professor, use the most of? And which one of these, by the same token, as a student, would you like to see the most of? Number one, Samantha has successfully defended 2 major theses in her field, or 2 major theses in the field have been successfully defended by Samantha.
First one.
Active voice. The active
First one.
First one.
Yes,
First
why?
one.
Because
The
you
importance is given to
highlight
the
the
students.
agency.
We're
Agency
more
is given.
interested in Samantha, yes.
Yes, Samantha, isn't the letter of recommendation at the end of the day about Samantha, right? That's who we're writing about. And for my dear colleagues here or students exploring systemic functional linguistics, there's an area under systemic functional linguistics called theme and rime.
Yes.
Theme and rime, if you would like to explore it further. Now, a basic feature, once again, to go back to our example, a basic feature of the letter of recommendation is to showcase a student's accomplishment, right? So what this means is that in order to showcase this milestone accomplishment by Samantha, which is defending 2 theses in her field successfully, Samantha must take subject position. Therefore, you know, the result is active voice construction. Now, just to recapitulate, before we move on to our final reflections, in customer service support, which is a technical field, passive voice is encouraged. Your computer has been fixed, right? In writing a letter of recommendation, however, the active voice is recommended. Samantha has successfully defended 2 major theses in her field. Now, sometimes, thanks to language awareness, the learners may be able, hopefully, to pinpoint these differences between active and passive voice, as well as other grammatical structures, all by themselves without the help of their teacher in the classroom, especially when they're outside of the classroom. Now to our final reflections. We can say that language awareness, a couple of findings from our discussion today, or a couple of conclusions, that it boosts students' self-esteem and confidence in their ability to take language learning into their own hands. The students, therefore, will not have to rely solely or only on their presence in the classroom or on the teacher's explicit instruction. And speaking of explicit instruction, by the way, neuroscientists distinguish between 2 kinds of learning: implicit learning and explicit learning. They identify explicit learning as the, quote, a repeated exposure to comprehensible input without conscious awareness. Wow, that's pretty heavy. In other words, traditional classroom teaching, where the teacher delivers content and the students receive, often in a passive manner, I believe is the closest to meaning to that quote. The students may be given the priority to practice the material amongst themselves in the classroom, granted, right? But this practice might still be limited to the material in its explicit form, like surface level structure, right? From you know, the structure, the explicit form as it is taught in the classroom. So far, we've focused quite a bit on English language learners, right? But what about trainee teachers or teachers who are training to be classroom teachers? For the most part, we expect our certified trainee teachers to go in the classroom and do what they do best. After all, aren't trainee teachers ready to engage successfully with their students as soon as they walk into the classroom? Something to think about. In this regard, I would like to share the following quote by Bolito, 2003. I don't like to copy paste big texts onto my PowerPoint slides, but I could not resist the urge this time. because I believe this quote is a great representation of the model classroom teacher. And the quote is, "Neither proficiency in a language nor knowledge about that language are sufficient on their own to equip a teacher to teach it. Trainee teachers need to be able to analyze language, to apply different strategies for thinking about language, analogizing, contrasting, substituting, etc., in order to be able to plan lessons, predict learners' difficulties, answer their questions, and write and evaluate materials." Now, based on this quote, the question again is, how can we prepare our trainee teachers from a language awareness perspective? How can we prepare them for such a successful engagement with the students? How do we develop a model of teacher education that promotes independent thinking, that promotes basically, how can we help them apply the theoretical knowledge, in other words, that they have acquired in their pre-service training courses? The answer, once again, is language awareness. Language awareness, hence, does not apply to just English language learners. In fact, language awareness can similarly equip our trainee teachers with the, I always like to use these words, the apparatus necessary to think for themselves in order to be able to perform all of the tasks outlined in this important quote by Bolito. Now, we can also help our trainee teachers achieve these important milestones by encouraging experimentation vis-a-vis a personalized choice of course design and teaching materials. In other words, let's give our teachers the freedom to at least, if they're not allowed to choose their own materials, at least supplement those materials that they are required to use with additional materials that can help them, let's say, tailor their teaching to specific student needs and specific course objectives and learning outcomes. Here at Marshall University, for example, I get to choose my own textbooks. These are textbooks that reflect my personal teaching philosophy, not a predominant teaching philosophy that, in a worst case scenario, let's say, would be imposed on all teachers. I also devise and design my own personal lessons and activities. These lessons and activities help me align my teaching methods with specific course objectives and learning outcomes. Now, just like we can't, I just wanted to give an example here for illustration purposes. Just like we can't expect movie actors, for example, to embrace a blanket or universal acting style, right? It would be boring to see that Denzel Washington, for example, acts the exact same way as other actors who are not usually given those kinds of roles, right? So should our trainee teachers similarly be given ample opportunity to be themselves in the language classroom. Now, one downside to this approach is the endless circle of trial and error that teachers are or may be prone to, especially in their early years of teaching. But that's okay, because I personally, I made tons of teaching mistakes, especially in my first year or two of teaching, because I was still trying to figure out who I was as a teacher. Now, after 11 years of ESL and university level teaching, I believe I finally have a clear picture of who I am as a classroom teacher, thanks to the, if you will, reflection and experimentation opportunities afforded by language awareness. Language awareness, in other words, is a stimulating tool. it has allowed me, it allows teachers a clear view of their inside. And since we're talking about downsides, an area that could benefit from future of language awareness in relation to different learning styles. Now, we talk about different teaching styles, of course, which language awareness allows, and I hope that my active versus passive voice examples today are a good reflection of this, as I'm sure you would probably teach active and passive differently, maybe yes, maybe no. But have we given enough consideration, ample consideration to our students having different learning styles? Personally, I don't see this as being a roadblock, if you will, because as teachers, we should capitalize on the different learning styles of our students, because these learning styles are the perfect ingredients for incorporating and encouraging language awareness as part of the teaching pedagogy. Another important initiative or area of research inquiry could be inviting the Moroccan Ministry of Education to consider producing foreign language textbooks that use a learner-centered language awareness approach. That can mean different things, as is the case with the following countries: Namibia, Norway, Singapore. The ministries of education in these countries have decided to adopt a learner-centered language awareness approach in their foreign language textbooks. Finally, I would like to close with the following quote by Tomlinson, 2003. The words in italics are my own, the ellipsis and everything. We hope for a future approach to language teaching that is language awareness based, whereby learners may become more critical in the sense of being more questioning and better equipped to challenge language conventions, language attitudes, and language policies when it is in their best interest to do so. This concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor OUDGHIRI, for your highly insightful, inspiring, and explanatory presentation, which covered lot of issues from both the students and the teachers' perspectives. And we give the floor to our students, our colleagues, to ask questions, give comments, or make any additions they may have. Okay, so the floor is yours, dear students, colleagues. Mm-hmm. So who wants to start, please?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, good afternoon.
I just would like first to thank you for these webinars. I would like to thank the presenters, Manal and Ayub, and the wonderful presentation of Professor OUDGHIRI. I just would like to, let's say, draw the attention of professors and students as well to the distinction between language awareness in the under, let's call it under tertiary level, and of course language awareness in tertiary level, because as you may notice, I'm talking to professors, students come with certain perception that arts in the English department to learn the language and not to learn about the language. And here I will borrow one of the words that our students use it today, the word knowledge, okay, as of course as a definition to language awareness, which is knowledge of the language. So in the tertiary level here, we talk about the knowledge about the language, or what people like to call it academic English rather than English. And sometimes we can find approaches like English for academic purposes. So my question probably to Professor OUDGHIRI, how can we push our students to shift their awareness, okay, to this knowledge about the language rather than knowledge of the language? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe your voice is cutting out a little bit, but the question is clear. The question is clear. Thank you for asking. It's an excellent question. I believe that the easy answer to that question is it all starts with the base. When you have a solid base, there's very little chance for you to not be successful down the road. It all starts with a solid approach, an informed, if you will, philosophy from the Ministry of Education to, once again, if you remember me mentioning learner-centered, language awareness approach, it starts from the beginning. How do we teach our kids language, not just in the classroom? How do we teach? I have two kids, for example. How do I teach them language at home, for example? How do I teach them to speak? When they say something, I say, that's not appropriate, and I move on. Versus, that's not appropriate, and here is why. So putting our kids in context from the beginning, from the get-go, from the very beginning of their life, teaching them, here's why this specific structure or this specific way of speaking is the way to go, right? Versus here's why this other way of speaking is not appropriate. So the base there, when it's pretty solid, when they transition into the classroom, at least they have that clear view of what they can expect their teachers to teach them. Now it starts at home. Which, you know, home is a microcosm of society. You know, how do we you know, sociolinguists can tell us a lot about this. Then it moves on to primary. You know, now here in the US we have preschool. You know, in Morocco we have the same system, and then we have elementary education. Then we have secondary, middle school, and then high school. So it all starts from the beginning, from home to society, to the classroom, elementary, to middle school, to high school, to prepare them for undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate studies. It's like taking someone and teaching them to play tennis, for example, at age 16 or 17. They can dream to hit strokes as well as, you know, strokes that are as good as Federer's or Nadal's strokes, for example, but they would not be able to. I hope that everybody is also familiar with the critical, what is it called? The critical age hypothesis, something like at a certain age, 13 years old is where your ability to acquire that proficiency type, you know, way of speaking the language stops. So I say, I hope I have answered your question. It all starts from the beginning. And I hope that through our discussion today, we can start a conversation about how to be able to, let's say, form committees, the way that we do here, for example, at my university in the US. We form committees when we have an overarching problem, right, an umbrella problem. The way to approach it initially is to start with small committees at the department level and then go at the college level and the university level. How can we you know, how can we communicate, if you will, this need to instill or to implement the learner-centered language awareness approach? How can we communicate that to the Ministry of Education? It all starts from here, from this Zoom webinar today, right? And then committees, and it grows big until it gets to the Ministry of Education.
Yes, any other question, please? Thank you
Yes, I
very
had a
much.
question.
Yes, I have.
Yes, who wants to
Please,
ask?
we have linguistic competence when it comes to mother tongue. Can we establish a connection between language awareness in the foreign language and this mother tongue or linguistic competence? And thank you.
I need you to ask that question one more time, please, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course. Please, we have linguistic competence for the mother tongue, like the intuition. Can we consider that language awareness is somehow a parallel to this concept in foreign language acquisition? Yes.
I believe so. I believe so. The key word in your question is intuition. Sometimes the teacher does not have to say it all in the classroom, right? For the students to be able to understand. Because they have that, if you will, inner mechanism inside of them that tells them, you know what? Our teacher, and this happened with me, by the way, when I was learning English back in the days. I don't believe the way that my teacher put it today is the right way to do it. And I am amazed at how today I know that that was not the right way to put it, but I didn't know why back then, right? So intuition is very important. Mother tongue, once again, it all depends on first language. For example, there are multiple research studies that indicate, or that at least suggest, that foreign language speakers from certain countries, of course, there's not enough empirical evidence to suggest that, but certain speakers from certain countries can perform a lot better than non-native speakers from other countries. For instance, we hear a lot about Moroccans picking up the English language really quickly, whereas other countries in the Middle East, right, or in the Far East have this hard time acquiring that language. Maybe there's this little something in Darija, the language that we speak, the dialect that we speak every day, right? So that intuition, I believe, is mysterious. How do babies, for example, acquire their first language? Scientists and linguists to this day, still are not able to wrap their minds around how fast, how effective babies, acquire, how effectively they acquire that language. So can we talk about that intuition as being connected or related to the mother tongue, for example? Is there something in that mother tongue that can trigger that intuition, if you will, and reinforce it, especially when that person is exposed to another foreign language? That's an area of research, and I believe that's a very good question.
Thank you.
Yes, can I make an addition, please?
Please, go ahead.
Yes. Yes, first of all, I would like to thank my professors. Thank you very much, Professor Aminu Drury, for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you. So I just wanted to highlight the benefits of language awareness. I strongly believe that the more students are aware of how the language works, the more they learn and the more they make mental connections and links about the language. And at the end of the day, we find that their cognitive abilities are more enhanced. And that's why I believe that students' attention should be drawn to this issue at the very beginning. So because it would be constructive to explicitly introduce them to this, as you, Professor, did using the passive and the active voice examples. And one further point is that language awareness also helps enhance lifelong learning and distance learning, because it makes one reflect on his own learning wherever he is, which is very critical to the process of learning. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other person, please? Yes.
Yes, Professor Slawi, if you don't mind.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, Professor Abdellah.
تحياتي أستاذي.
Okay, شكرا سيدي أودغيري. بارك الله فيك. Thank you very much for this talk. It's really rich and interesting, and I'm happy to see you again and proud of you. I can say that at the level of socially constructed space, because the classroom is considered a cell where interaction produces what? Not only language, but also culture and information, which is the only medium of exchange an individual has with which to build a presence. I would say that the language awareness, and you talked about something very important when you talked about strengths and weaknesses at the level of how we should teach foreign language. I would say that I am really interested in how we should implement, I would say, a vision, a new vision by ministry, because there are what we call political matters. But to implement this vision, is it done by politicians in the US or by what we call teachers? Everything is related to pedagogy and so many things. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdellah. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
so thank you first for your presentation. So my question is related to assessment. How can we make of assessment and language testing an opportunity for language awareness? Thank you.
Thank you.
Assessment as it relates to language testing, you said?
Yes, language testing and assessment as an opportunity for language awareness.
That's a good question. I don't think I have a good answer for that. Maybe that's an area of research inquiry. Now, a keyword there is assessment. I would like to ask you, if you don't mind,
Yes.
if you could kindly elaborate a little bit on the relationship between assessment and language testing. I'm not sure I see. I mean, I can imagine there being a relationship between the two, but when you say, yes, go ahead, please.
Because learners see that assessment can be a hassle, so they're usually demotivated to learn language. So maybe we can use a good way to make them more interested into learning the language through communicatively testing them.
Okay, so testing them in the classroom, sure. Testing their communicative competence is probably okay. Assessment is always a tricky area. By the way, next week, all of next week, I'm taking part in, we have something called Assessment Week here in our department, Marshall, yearly assessment week, and we assess our students' writing in the majors. Assessment is tricky. How do we do assessment? Is there a one-size-fits-all way to do assessment? Of course not. It depends on the context. So here at Marshall, we assess our students' writing based on specific objectives and learning outcomes. So I guess the best way to start is to ask the question, what are my learning, what are the specific course objectives and learning outcomes that I'm focusing on this semester, right? And of course, you could align all of your activities to those specific objectives and outcomes. That's the best way to start it. So it depends on the activity. For example, if I would like to assess how my students use active versus passive, right? I can, for example, if it's a conversation task, I can bring them two scenarios from real life, and we can do something like role playing in the classroom. How would you respond to this specific statement from area X? How would you respond to the exact same statement from area Y? Are we going to make the same statement? Now, the content, the substance of it is the same as we saw with active versus passive. But the trick is, how can we teach our students different ways of expressing certain ideas. So role playing might be a great way to do it. How do you assess whether your students get, understand, in other words, versus active versus passive? Well, the activity that we went over today is a great example. If you want to to make sure that they really understand active versus passive, don't just look at the way that they construct those sentences. Look at how they use those sentences in context, of course. I hope I have answered your question. And of course, in writing, you would do it differently. Here in the United States, we assign our students to write essays and papers heavily, right? I personally don't believe in final exams or midterm exams. I don't do them. Everything is communicative. Everything is written down. I do something called final revision portfolio, for example, where the students revisit their work every now and then as they go, applying, of course, the specific strategies from the mini lessons that we do in class.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, any other question, please?
I actually have a comment. Thank you first for your very beneficial presentation.
Thank you.
Speaking of, actually my question did not have to do with language awareness, but with passive voice. I guess the example that you provided us with. So speaking of the passive voice, I guess it is also useful to teach students about the reason why sometimes the agent is omitted and some other times it is mentioned. I'll give you an example. In a newspaper's headline, we may have, for example, the building was bombed by terrorists. And here we can mention that terrorists are mentioned in the headline. Why? Because terrorists are perceived to belong to minorities. If we have other agents, suppose we have a bunch of white men, I guess we will have a different headline without mentioning the ones or the agents behind the act. We would have instead, the building was bombed, and that's it.
Yes, there's an ideology behind it,
Yes.
Absolutely. And I even remember back in the days when I was learning prepositions, for example. There was a commentary by one of the commentators on a news station 20 years ago, I think, 17 years ago. The first commentator said the war, no, that was not 20 years ago, that was 2003, the war in Iraq, right? 17 years ago. So the first commentator said the war in Iraq, the other one said the war on Iraq, right? Now that's pretty strategic, because what does that, we can teach our students here's in, here's on, here's above, here's below, here's underneath. We can also teach them those things in context. Now, the systemic functional linguistics, SFL, which is one of the my research areas, certain active voice sentences can have an embedded passive construction in them. What does that mean? They look active voice, right? And I hope everybody is familiar with transitive versus intransitive verbs and different things like that. So for example, if we take the example of Amine, right? And the phone, you could say Amine broke the phone, or the phone was broken by Amine. What if I told you that I have a whole different construction that can mean both of them at the same time? You want to hear it? The phone broke. Right? The phone broke. It's amazing how much you can accomplish through language, right? You don't have to go fully active or go fully passive. The phone broke. Did the phone break itself? Of course not. That's not the meaning.
Yes,
yeah, and you see what we're doing, Iman and I, what we're doing right now is we're reflecting on the language, right? We're reflecting, we're trying to understand what things mean, right? So for example, when you go to a lot of the stores at the mall, you see, what do you see? Buy one, get one free, right? Why is it that they don't say get one free when you buy one? Another question, right? So it's strategic. It's always strategic. And the way that language is being used every day is, now we need to be really careful because language can impact us in a big way. And we have to be careful. Thank you for your comment.
Further question, please. Yes, professors, colleagues, any question?
I just wanted to add a little something, if you don't mind, Professor Slawi. So one key feature or characteristic of academic writing, for example, or technical writing in general, especially academic writing, research, journal articles, for example, right? Now, in those journal articles, what do you find? Just pick one, and you will notice. You will find a lot of modal verbs. Modal verbs. Do we know what modal verbs are? May, could, right? And so on and so forth. Why is it that in academic writing, we use those modal verbs heavily? Well, number one, because you as a researcher, you don't want to be responsible for the things that you say. This may indicate versus this indicates, right? So you're shifting that responsibility away from you. There's that level of abstractness, if you will, in the writing. It's very abstract. There's a lot of, so once again, we teach our students in the classroom modal verbs. May means this, can means that, right? Which is very good, right? That's the base. But we should also incorporate some of the language awareness magic, if you will, into that teaching of the language.
But don't you think, sir, that sometimes we use those modal verbs to leave a room to doubt? Because everything should be questionable, no?
Yes, that's what it is. That's what it is. That's exactly what I mean. It's may indicate. It means I'm not responsible. It means you as a researcher who's reading my journal article, how about you could you please kindly further the research yourself, right? And see if you could either confirm my findings, if you will, or, you know, if I'm wrong in one or more areas, you could correct me.
All right.
Yes, Professor.
Yes, Mr. Karim?
Yes, please go ahead.
I have just a comment. I think someone has just mentioned that it's important when students are language aware. I think that it's important as well when teachers are language aware, because it means that they're better language users in the classroom. So they'll be aware of the language they're using. It has a huge impact or a huge influence on their students' comprehension of the content. Thank you.
Can you hear him, Professor OUDGHIRI?
Yes, yes. Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Well, that was a comment, right? Not a question. Or was it a question?
No, it's just a comment, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I have a question.
Please,
So,
Mr.
do you think
students who has a comment here, he couldn't speak, he has a problem with his mic.
Okay.
So it's Mr. Leon C. He says that he had my question for the speaker is, don't you think that language awareness is more in favor of accuracy and hence hinders fluency? So could you please react to him, this question?
Professor Slawi, your voice was cutting out. Could you please repeat the question?
So it is written in the conversation. If you can see it, please. Yeah. So he says, don't you think that language awareness is more in favor of accuracy and hence hinders fluency? Yes. Thank you.
Accuracy. Okay. What do we mean by accuracy? I mean, once again, that's an area of research. What does it mean to be an accurate? What does it mean to speak accurately or write accurately, right? Now, we go back once again to our initial point about the explicit learning. or one size fits all, right? Personally, if you ask my opinion, and I may be wrong, I don't believe that language accuracy, that language awareness primarily promotes accuracy. It does not. Remember when I mentioned trial and error? Now that's a process that you can go through. That's how we learn. We have this popular proverb that says, we learn from our mistakes, for example, right? So I don't believe that, personally at least, and I may be wrong, I don't believe that language awareness promotes accuracy, at least in its strict sense of the term. And it all depends, once again, on the context. It all depends on the lesson being taught. It all depends on the theme, on the course objective, specific course objective, specific course outcome. I believe that we are way past that era of, let's say, ridiculing our students for not being able to say certain words properly, right? Or not being able to generate that sentence the way that it should be generated. Baby steps is what awareness promotes, I would say, not accuracy. Language awareness promotes baby steps. The famous proverb, the 1,000-mile journey starts with the first step, right? That's what language awareness is. I hope I have been able to answer your question.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, Iman. Iman has a remark or question.
I have a question, please.
Yes, Iman.
Yes.
Iman, can you please?
Yes, I guess Professor Sidi has a question. She may ask first, and I can go with her.
You ask the question.
Okay. Okay. So, do you think, Professor, that it is compulsory for students and teachers to have cultural awareness before language awareness? Because sometimes I think we may speak the same language, but we do not have a full understanding of whether we mean the same thing or not. Yes.
You answered your question yourself. Yes, absolutely. Cultural awareness is important. It's imperative. It's of paramount importance, if you will. And we see this a lot with, we have a program here in the US with the United States State Department, or like Wizarat al-Kharijiyya, English language programs. For example, if you would like to, as a teacher or as a professor, to partake in that program, to enlist in the program, to go overseas, for example, to teach English, let's say in Morocco or in France or in Peru or in Indonesia, basically you're qualified, right? You have the credentials, you're qualified, you have the teaching certifications, you have enough teaching hours in the classroom and enough experience. But are you familiar with the culture of the country where you're going to teach, right? So what they do is before they let you travel to that country, it's a federal program. They put you in some sort of like seminar classes, if you will, to teach you about the culture of Morocco, right? For like a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, and then you take a test to make sure that you're familiar with the culture, that you're not going to, of course, face any problems, both on the street and more importantly, in the classroom. So yes, cultural competence is of paramount importance. Now, when I have taught at both I have taught both ESL and university level courses, right? So in my university level courses, I have mostly American students. Guess what? The first couple of years of teaching American students, I struggled a lot, not in terms of my teaching, but in terms of coming to grasp with, understanding the mentality of the American student, right? Of the American student. Now I'm pretty familiar with it. I can walk in the classroom and I know I can expect, I have certain expectations. But at the beginning, of course, it's hard. I had lived in the US for a few years before I started teaching. Now that a lot of people would say, well, wasn't that enough just living in the US? Why did you struggle in the classroom? It's two different realms, two different worlds. So teaching ESL is it the same as teaching business writing in a classroom full of domestic American students? Absolutely not, right? I personally identify a lot. I love to teach ESL. I go in and I see a lot of the international students. I have different countries, different learning styles. I enjoy teaching American students as well. They're very interesting. And of course, each one has its own set of struggles.
Okay, Ilham, please, your question.
Ilham.
Ilham, Sadani. Ilham first. Yes, Ilham. Yes, miss, please, your question. Ilham Mhalzi, you raise your hand. Okay, we give the floor next to Professor Sadani if she is not available. Yes, Professor Sadani. We can't hear you, we can't hear you. Please turn down.
Okay, now it's okay?
Yes, we can
hear you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Abderrahim KARFA, for this interesting meeting, which have, of course, started earlier. And thank you very much, Professor OUDGHIRI, for the enlightening and interesting topic. So as we know, theories of language are currently, or language teaching and learning are currently undergoing rapid change. And the implementation of language awareness approach in our classrooms depends, of course, or actually on our ability to provide instruction that engage or that may engage students in the learning process. And a lot of, I think that a lot of instructional components may include, like talking, may be included, like for instance, talking about the language, like for instance, verbalizing ideas, like for instance, involving them in the student-centered discovery and exploration. We engage them affectively, as was said by Professor Aminu Drury. So it's a bottom-up teaching approach and not a top-down teaching approach. And I will say, in relation to what have been said or to the previous virtual meetings, we've been speaking about how effective can we be as teachers, right, on online teaching. So my question here, can we speak about certain components or techniques, okay, that we have to implement to activate this language awareness through, of course, online teaching and distant learning, and of course, the actual approaches to language teaching. And thank you very much, Professor OUDGHIRI.
Thank you so much for your question. Your question reminds me of Miss Iman Salami's statement about, or question about, cultural competence. Online teaching is a whole different culture as well. So we need to develop a good understanding of that culture as well. It makes a huge difference to teachers who are either willing to teach online or are about to teach online to at least equip them with the both the theoretical and the pedagogical apparatus before they engage online teaching and before they engage their students in online platforms. The way that we develop our LMS structure, the platforms, learning learning systems. What does the M stand for in LMS? Please remind me. Learning management systems. So the way that we develop those learning management systems, our success, in other words, in online, in implementing language awareness-based pedagogies will depend on the way that we put together and that we construct those learning management system platforms. It's a good question. It's not easy to answer. Once again, it depends on the specific platform in use. It depends on the specific lesson, right? If you're teaching speaking online, Is it the same as teaching writing online, right?
Exactly.
Different activities. And so it all depends, of course, on now that's the beauty of research. My first presentation last week was on e-learning theory and pedagogies. Can we talk about e-learning theory and pedagogies? Of course we can, but see these, especially in the advent, if you will, of COVID-19, everybody is right now seriously thinking about moving academic operations online, at least as a precautionary measure. Not necessarily permanently, right? Because I don't see the physical classroom going away anytime soon. Now, but once again, I hope I answered your question, Professor Saidani.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Clay, please, Iman.
Yes, dear Professor. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. First, I would like to address lots of thanks to our dear professors, of course, Professor Slawi and Professor KARFA, as well as Professor Saidani, and others, of course, special thanks to Professor OUDGHIRI for the informative, instructive, and actually insightful presentation. I have a comment concerning the language awareness. First, I can't agree more that in order to be glib or eloquent at a certain language, of course, you are not solely required to be well acquainted with a great deal of vocabulary, but also to know how to use that vocabulary together in the appropriate, of course, structure. Here, the active structure, for example, the active structure or the passive structure. And as you said, Professor, of course, when we select, right, the passive or the active structure, this depends on either we want actually to forward the agent, the subjects, or backward it. For example, when I say my car has been stolen, okay, and someone has stolen my car, so here we insert the same vocabulary in both sentences, but what varies is the structure. So when I say, for example, right, my car has been stolen, okay, so it doesn't matter who has stolen it, but what matters, all right, is that my car is not here with me. And then I would like to shed light on the idea that the language we use is actually not neutral, right? And the media actually exerts certain influence upon us by the use of this language. So, for example, when we talk about passivization or nominalization, right, along with passivization, they has an important ideological function such as the latent agency and reifying processes. For example, the passivization allows a writer to leave out the actor, right? And it enables newspaper, for instance, to protect sources by omitting the seer, or to retell their own opinions as though they were somebody else's, right? For example, when they say it is believed or it is said, right, that BJP will not survive the confidence vote in Indian Parliament, the omission of the actor will avoid actually apportioning the blame or responsibility. And thank you, sir.
Thank you, Iman. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Professor KARFA.
Yes, I would like to talk for maybe 5 minutes, if you don't mind.
Of course, Professor, the floor is yours.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, Professor OUDGHIRI, for first your methodology of presenting the most important issues involved in language awareness. And last time I said that I would like to refer to the way you have been interacting with us as a questions-based pedagogy. Yes, I like it. So I would like to give a brief overview to help understand, to join your efforts, understanding what language awareness is all about. How can we make connections between, for example, language awareness and lifelong learning, language awareness and learners' autonomy, which are seemingly contradictory. They may seem that language awareness is concerned with a focus on accuracy, on grammar, on structures, on components of language, and at the same time it is lifelong learning, and it is autonomous learning, and it is reflective learning and teaching, etc. I would like to remind particularly my students of the three governing theories of language teaching and learning, particularly language acquisition, first language acquisition and second language learning. In the first semester, we talked about the areas that existed between behaviorism and structuralism. And we said language acquisition and language learning within the framework of behaviorism led by B.F. Skinner is or holds that the process that language acquisition and learning is a process of imitation and repetition and habit formation. Okay? So the learner is a passive recipient of knowledge that teachers own and control. So the student is passive recipient of that knowledge. The mind is a tabula rasa. Language, we develop the language we are exposed to in the environment through imitation. So here, the role of teachers and the role of learners and the goals of the process, the goals of education itself, to make some necessary connections. The role and the ultimate objective of education at the time was not to build effective or to develop effective, well-informed, responsible citizens, lifelong learner, lifelong learning citizens, because this was not the objective of behaviorism and positivism behind. What happened next? The Chomskyan revolution, particularly Chomsky's reaction against the principles, the foundations of behaviorism. His reaction to B.F. Skinner and logical paradox, okay, which would have far-reaching implications that language exists in the mind. In the mind is not a tabula rasa. There is the language acquisition device, which is responsible for helping us to select from, okay, when exposed to a language environment, that language acquisition device is activated. And of course, the child internalizes, okay, that language he is exposed to from the UG and the parameters. Chomsky, to avoid some myths about Chomsky's contribution, Chomsky was a structuralist too, because he focused on language as structure and on competence. But at least the contribution of Chomsky was so great because at least he gave scholars at the time, or gave a chance for the child and the student, okay, to exercise certain human agency, but it was limited to one component of what language is. What happened in the 1960s? In the 1960s, I think 1961 or 2, the publication of How to Do Things with Words by Austin, and the emergence of pragmatics, discourse analysis later, CER 1968, the functions of language, sociolinguistics in 1968 by Labov, and a number of other disciplines, okay? So the shift from the dominance of Durkheimian sociology to new trends in sociology, anthropology, etc. What happened in politics and human rights? The 1960s was characterized by the independence of many countries and the emergence of new powers, the Soviet Union and China, and the cultural revolutions, and some events in France itself in 1968. So a movement, a human rights movement, in addition to the humanistic movement in all fields, and particularly in education, as a result of the 2 world wars, which witnessed a collapse of human values. And I think new movements of humanism may appear, and I think should emerge after this COVID-19 crisis. Many things should be reconsidered, okay? So the emergence, these fields, and this movement towards, or this humanistic movement and human rights movement and citizenship movement, etc., and the emergence of new definitions of what language is that we are concerned with. And of course, you know the famous article of Heinz, communicative competence. What happened? What did Heinz do? He borrowed or brought the title, part of the title of sociolinguistics of Labov's founding book, in addition to Chomsky's linguistic competence, focus on linguistic competence, and the term communicative from the title of an interesting article, I think published by Gamis, I don't forget the name, by the end of the 60s, the ethnography of communication. He brought this together and wrote an interesting article on communicative competence. How did course designers, teachers, trainers, and some policymakers, how did they react to this article? Okay, they started working on programs which are communicative, and the emergence of communicative language teaching, and later on learner-centeredness. But the first drafts of communicative language teaching were the situational and the functional syllabi. Scholars, applied linguists, and practitioners at the time considered that communication and communicative language teaching is a matter of content. But thanks to Professor Widosa in 1974, who stated that communication is not a matter of content. And there is no syllabus, such thing as a communicative syllabus. Communicative language teaching and communication is a methodological matter. That is, learners learn best from communication in which they participate. And the story continued. So what happened by the very beginning of the 1970s is that communicative competence and communicative language teaching became very prestigious. Everyone at the time in the 1970s and the 1980s, and maybe in some countries such as ours in the 1990s, claimed to be communicative and to apply communicative language teaching, which was not the case. That prestige created some sort of dogmatism, a new dogmatism in times of change. It was considered as a neglect of grammar and structure of many components of language. And of course, the focus was on fluency and on the idea that fluency, that grammar comes next. We learn language from conversation. And many educators worldwide started complaining, particularly in Britain, about the language competence of students. So the re-emergence, because the dominance exercised by structuralism and behaviorism in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s happened later. The same dominance was exercised by Chomsky's theories and communicative language teaching in its limited sense. Language awareness emerged to strike the balance between all components of language on the one hand, to strike the balance between the whys of learning and teaching languages and the ultimate objectives of education. That limited perspective on understanding of fluency while learning foreign languages, okay, gave rise or resulted in serious complaints about alienation, assimilation, acculturation, etc. Okay, particularly that the focus was on developing language unconsciously, on acquisition, in its once again in its limited understanding. Language awareness, as Professor OUDGHIRI has kindly clarified, it is not only a perspective on which language, which component or components of language are of priority, but it is, we can claim, a new approach to language education. It is not concerned only with the components of a particular language and how to design programs, etc. It is also about the relationship between languages and their speakers and cultures, and it is about the relationship between different varieties and dialects within the same society. So it is very important that scholars, decision makers, policy makers have once again given language awareness what or at least the place it deserves, at least in current discussions. and in research as well. Language awareness is also awareness of the explicit awareness of the cultural component of language. It is also about positive attitudes and high motivation. It is about some values of tolerance, etc. To learn explicitly the language skills, all language, not only speaking, what about the reading and the writing? And they are very important in developing critical thinking and reflective thinking and creative thinking as far as language is concerned. So how, and I think Professor OUDGHIRI have answered this question, how language education in general, foreign and second language education in particular, can serve the ultimate objectives of education, that is the development of lifelong learners, the development of lifelong, effective, well-informed, responsible, autonomous, etc. Citizens. So I personally think that this increasing interest in language awareness, which, by the way, it has become a very important issue in critical applied linguistics. And of course, within critical applied linguistics, many scholars recommend and argue that we need not only one applied linguistics, but different applied linguistics. We can talk about Moroccan applied linguistics, maybe Asian applied linguistics, it depends, okay? To serve our education institutions, and to improve our education policy, respond to ever-changing challenges, which are educational, economic, political, social, cultural, and maybe psychological. So language awareness is not a matter of focus on accuracy or fluency. Okay, it is the focus on the balance between all components of language, and the nature of relationship between languages and communities, societies, speaking those languages and identify themselves with those languages. Okay, so here I have just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 domains of, briefly, I will just 5 domains of language awareness: affective, social, power, cognitive, performance, and there are many others. Thank you very much for your listening. I'm sorry if I haven't been brief as I promised. نخلصوا انا
لان اولا قلتي غادي تهضر 5 دقائق هدرتي 20 دقيقه
لا كنت هنايا فاش دابا كنت فاش اشوف كليه الاداب كنا ودنا المدينه القديمه وشفنا كنا ما نعسناش.
لا تبارك الله عليك استاذي، تبارك الله عليك. You've provided a great overview of the theoretical dimensions of language awareness, and appreciate that so much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, any other
if there are any 1 or 2 or 3 questions, okay, so I'm ready to react. Otherwise, I will pay. ياك سي أمين.
ضروري.
شوف ها هو احنا محتفظين به.
بارك
بغيتي
الله
العشاء فاسي
فيك.
مرحبا، بغيتي جبلي مرحبا، بغيتي امازيغي احنا الحمد لله المغرب هذا هو اللي كنتذاكروا عليه. 5 دقائق انت واحد يعني واحد التنوع الوحده، وخصنا نديروا شي ويبينار من بعد حتى سيتمبر.
ديال
ايدنتيتي
الماكله.
اند دايفرسيتي.
لا
الماكله ونهضروا على الماكله.
فضل من الله ونعم. الحمد لله المغرب يسخروا ب يعني
الحمد لله.
الحمد
الحمد
لله.
لله. الحمد لله.
Yes, speaking of the webinar, go ahead, Professor. You said we need to conduct a webinar on what?
On diversity and identity.
Yes.
Cultural diversity and identity in Morocco.
Yes, inshallah.
ان شاء الله. ان شاء الله. هيا عندك الاستاذ السلاوي. الاستاذ السلاوي سجلها. You will be the organizing. Both of you and Professor OUDGHIRI and many other colleagues may join us. Okay, so the floor is yours, Professor Slawi. If there are questions or comments or additions, no problem. Otherwise,
you can close up. Yeah, please, if you have any more questions to either Professor KARFA or Professor OUDGHIRI, the floor is yours, please. I can see here one question.
Can I say something?
Yes, Professor OUDGHIRI. Who wants to speak?
Someone is asking. Probably somebody wants to say something.
Okay.
تفضل.
Yes. Okay. Please, Professor.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor OUDGHIRI, for your enlightening presentation, and it was really exciting for me to discover some of the notions that I didn't know before. But it triggered my mind to have issues to ask about or to comment, if you like. But just briefly, I will just take brief time to speak. Thank you, of course, to Mr. Our friend and dear colleagues, Abderrahim KARFA, and to our dear teacher and colleague, Mrs. Slawi, or Professor Slawi, and to all the other colleagues that I may have not mentioned. Professor OUDGHIRI, throughout your presentation, I didn't stop thinking about one concept in my mind, which is the verbal and linguistic intelligence raised by Howard Gardner in his multiple intelligence theory. When you were speaking about a language awareness, I kept thinking about this verbal and linguistic intelligence. As you know, that we have good speakers or good second language speakers are often considered to be talented people with special verbal abilities who possess more than one code to understand and acquire knowledge in order to use it in new situations. And we know also that although most individuals or individual learners are capable of learning a second language to some degree of competence, some learners are always better equipped for the second language learning task than others. Now here, that's why I keep your ideas kept triggering my knowledge about Gardner's scheme, although he did not directly, if you like, there is no direct reference in Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence to language learning or second language learning. But do you think that these two ideas or theories, language awareness that you were speaking about in your presentation, and language or verbal intelligence, verbal and linguistic intelligence raised by Howard Gardner, among the other intelligences, between inverted commas, the 7 or 8 types of intelligences raised by Howard Gardner, you know, the logical, mathematical, the intrapersonal, interpersonal, the musical, the rhythmic, etc. So we have 7 or 8, depending if you include the naturalistic. Now the point, coming back to the point, do you think that these two theories can go hand in hand, or they draw one from the other? This is my first point. And the second point, if it is a type of intelligence, this language awareness, if it is a type of intelligence, if we use Howard's term, how can we, if you like, first detect this awareness among our learners or our students in the classroom? How can we know those who have this awareness? How can we detect them? And second, if it is a type of intelligence, we know that intelligence increases and decreases with, like with activity, with exercise, etc. How can we increase their level or their awareness, as you call it, their linguistic or language awareness? How can we lay on it in order to develop, if you like, and to help our students develop more, between brackets, language awareness, to be more or better language learners? And of course, in the end, how can we test it before, as you mentioned in your presentation, before, pre and during and post? How can we test, if you like, that we are doing a good job in matters of testing or evaluation or assessment in general, the degrees of this awareness? I hope I am being clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to assume that you asked your questions both to, both to seek a possible answer, but at the same time for reflection purposes. And one thing that I always like to mention, to say in my classroom to my students is, sometimes I ask questions, but I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, because the questions themselves lend themselves to a possible answer that is embedded in the question itself. So great questions. Thank you so much for asking them. To try and answer your first question about intelligence, and there are so many kinds of intelligence. The one question that we need to ask is this intelligence acquired / learned, or is it innate? Are we born with certain levels of intelligence? Are we born with intelligence? If so, if we take 10 people who are born with a certain type of intelligence, the other question is also, are there different levels of this intelligence? And so is it acquired or is it innate? We know that, for instance, I'll give you my example. I am terrible at drawing and singing. You don't want to hear my voice, when I sing. I'm terrible. So I was not, in other words, born with that innate, if you will, for lack of a better term, intelligence to sing, or I don't have that aptitude, right, for singing or for drawing, for that matter. If it is acquired intelligence that we are, if it's innate intelligence and students are born with it, a keyword earlier that was mentioned is intuition. How can we tap into this intuition, which is essentially a form of intelligence? How can we tap into this intuition and develop it, help the students develop that intuition? If it is innate, of course. How do we know if it's innate or not? I mean, we can see signs. For example, a lot of the students in our classrooms, they pick up the language really quickly, right? They pick it up really quickly. They have that innate ability to do it. They have that intuition, they have that intelligence. But what does that mean? Does it mean that they're more intelligent than other people? Of course not. Intelligence is relative. It's a philosophical question as well. Now, I may be intelligent, I may have that intelligence in singing, but it doesn't mean I'm intelligent in everything else, right? I may be intelligent in singing, I may have that aptitude to sing, but when I go on the tennis court, I'm really terrible. For example, I can't do it. So if it's innate, how do we, and that has to do with your second question, how can we detect that language awareness in our students? Through various activities, real life activities, right? It's basically the best scenario that comes to mind is, for lack of a better example, is Jamal Fana. For example, you see the guy with the flute, right? And the snake, you know, the snake is inside, but how do you entice that snake to come out of the jug, for example, right? You play that music. So it's basically something that you can use. It's a tool, it's a stimulating tool. We can use those activities in the classroom as stimulating tools to tap into that intelligence. If, however, this intelligence is not innate, if the person is not born with a certain type of intelligence, then we can move to consider, for example, developing that intelligence in our students. How do we do it? The answer is language awareness, right? The different principles of language awareness that we discussed today, the different activities. How do you teach active versus passive? Are you going to teach it just from a surface level structure based approach, or are you going to delve a little deeper into it and help the students understand the why element, not just the how, but the why element? How do we detect that? To try and answer your second question, language awareness, assessment, right? Assessment is a great way to do it. Testing students either through in-class activities, group work. There's something that an activity that I highly appreciate. I have not had the chance to use it in my classroom because I probably have not had to. What do you do with, and this probably does not have anything to do with language awareness, but how do you build that self-esteem and self-confidence in your students? By the same token, it might be related to language awareness. Let's say you have shy students in your classroom. Now, what I do, what I learned from other colleagues is, when you have a shy student in your classroom and they are not really participating, right? They're not engaged, they're not active in the classroom. We use Blackboard here at Marshall. And so before class, you post whatever the theme of discussion of that day, you post like a pre-activity on Blackboard in the form of a discussion board. You ask a question and everybody has to answer those questions or that question before they come to the classroom. And so you read the answers before you walk in the classroom and you select those answers by the shy students, right? And for example, you take those answers and you project them onto the big screen in the classroom and you say, Mike or Michael, I really loved your answer. Your answer is actually the closest to answering my question. What do you say about your answer? And then you engage them in the discussion, right? They're like, they have that you start to build that self-esteem, that self-confidence in them. So it's through microcosms, if you will, through small activities, bottom up is all it starts with a solid base. I hope I have answered your question, but once again, this is something that lends itself to future research inquiry.
Professor OUDGHIRI.
Thank you. Yes.
Question for you, please, which may be related to both presentations you gave last time and today's. Looking at language awareness from the e-learning perspective.
Yes.
How can we enhance our students' language awareness? Suppose you have only e-learning strategies, you are using only e-learning strategies,
yes.
Yeah.
That's a great question. It depends on the type of learning. Is it blended? Is it flipped? Is it fully online? Professor Sadani earlier asked the question, and I said that it all depends. You know, what are you teaching? Is it? See, this is the tricky thing. If and I teach an introductory course to American government as well. When I teach political science or American government, it's a lecture-based course. And the second half of the spring semester, when everything was moved online, I didn't really have a lot of problems delivering content to my students because it's a lecture based. So all we do is I have an outline, right? Talking points, we go over them. I engage my students in the discussion. That's it. They take notes, they go, and then that's the only class, by the way, in which I have quizzes, midterms, and finals. That's the only class. But my business writing and science and technical writing courses, I don't do final exams or midterms or quizzes. To go back to your question, how do we develop language awareness how do we implement language awareness strategies in e-learning? Once again, if I'm teaching a sociology course or a political science course, it's easy. Students take notes, they leave, right? They sit back, they enjoy the show, they leave. English is a second language, and I saw this in my wife. My wife is also Moroccan, and she was also a student in SAIS. We met there. She teaches English as a second language here at Marshall. So her students are international students. They're non-native speakers. And I saw how much she struggled at the beginning. Now she's doing it. Of course, we have summer courses. And I noticed that every single day she was thinking about ways to, how can I transfer those teaching pedagogies and lessons to online? It was a little bit of a struggle at the beginning, but of course, I think that I would say that it would not be terribly hard for anybody to move ESL instruction to online. The one thing that is intimidating is that move itself from the classroom to online. As long as when we are comfortable moving those operations online using, of course, the online platforms and being comfortable using those online platforms, I don't believe that you'd be a totally different teacher online than you would be in the classroom. The thing is, how do you engage your students more than how can I deliver the instruction? I don't think that should be a problem. How can I engage my students is the question.
Thank you very much, Professor Drury. Any one last question, probably, Professor KARFA? We take up one question and then
one more question and we close.
Okay, that's it. Okay, so one more question, please.
If there is one, otherwise.
Sir, please, I have a question for Professor KARFA. Thank you very much for clarifying a lot of misunderstandings I had about language awareness. Actually, about the term communicative competence, it was first coined by Himes, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm a little bit confused about the other competencies that constitute communicative competence, like sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, strategic competence. So what about these competencies? Were they coined by another scholars or other scholars?
Okay.
Should I repeat my question?
No, I have heard you. Yes, the message is clear. Your question is clear.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Do you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, Amine, for the notion of communicative competence, which was introduced by Himes, it was made up of two major components. Okay, linguistic competence, the way linguistic competence was defined by Chomsky. Structural competence, that is knowledge of the structural aspects of the language. And sociolinguistic competence, that is language use. But this definition, okay, this definition went through many changes which depended or were the result of the emergence of new disciplines, such as the emergence of discourse analysis resulted in another component, defining component of communicative competence. Then we had discourse competence. Emerging concern with lexicography and gave lexical competence as another component of communicative competence. Emerging interest in culture, issues related to language and culture and teaching and learning culture, we had cultural competence, strategic competence, pragmatic competence. At the very beginning of the 1990s, we had a new reorganization of these components. We had communicative competence and pragmatic competence. So it has never been stagnant. The development of the notion communicative competence was characterized by ever changes. And another development, which I think may be relevant to our discussion, is that introduced by Karen E. Johnson, 1995, which is classroom communicative competence. And the feeling and the understanding of this classroom communicative competence can be extended to the increasing importance and need for e-learning. Classroom communicative competence means that for students too, they are participative competencies. For a student to participate effectively in classroom interactive communication, he or she should be helped to develop some knowledge about the conventions, underlying conventions, which are social, communicational, sociolinguistic, characterizing the classroom as a social context. As a social context, so, and it is related to what I mentioned to yesterday, that is access to that context, access to that community. You need some contextual competencies to better access and participate in communication, which is social, cultural in nature and essence. Okay, so these evolutions, of course, were supported by continuous theorizing and research. I forgot to mention the emergence of the interactionist perspective on language teaching and learning and language acquisition, and the variety of research conducted on classroom and the shifts to classroom-based research and to ethnographic research conducted on the classrooms. And now we may think of some sort of competence, virtual competence, to effectively participate, effectively engage in virtual contexts and conversation, new or the emerging structure of communication online, cyberspaces. There are new environments and there are social environments. We should not think of them as technical environment. They are social, psychological, cultural. The emergence of a new sociocultural and psychological context. We don't have enough research on this context and the different variables that come together to define their nature, their structure, and their implications, far-reaching implications. I hope I have satisfied some of your curiosity, Iman.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor.
And the learners are always at the center in this enterprise. Professor Slawi, the floor is yours to
you close,
Also,
Professor? You
yeah.
close the session,
Okay,
please.
I would once again extend my special thanks to our friend, our distinguished friend, wonderful speaker, Si Aminu Drury. Some of us perhaps may become addicted to listening to you. Please, we will invite you many times. Yes, people, colleagues, students liked you, so we keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
My
very
pleasure. I would love to be back.
Your presentations are enlightening, not only at the level of content. I know that you don't believe in knowledge transmission the way it was done in the past, but that sense of questioning, or that questions based pedagogy is very important to promote reflective thinking, critical thinking, creative thinking. Questions sometimes are very important in themselves. Yes. Those who articulate good questions are always the winners. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about international conferences, yes, and academic events. Great scholars set the ground through asking questions, and they don't care about the answers, whether you are against them or for. When you set good questions, then and you open the space for debate, okay, and multiple perspectives and etc., then it's good. Thank you very much. I would like to thank and congratulate our students, master students, PhD students, for their attendance, their participation, and the conclusion that we may draw from this, that the 7th webinar is not like the first and the second. Now it seems that we have a lot from each other, and we feel at ease and familiar with this technology. Congratulations, master students, for the presentations you have prepared and delivered. I would like to warmly thank our colleagues who have joined us on these virtual seminars. I insist to repeat the names. من لا يشكر الناس لا يشكر الله. Professors Aziz Bqali, سي مدني, عز العرب حكيم بناني, سي ملياني, سي فؤاد بولعيد, الأستاذة كريمة بلغيتي, الأستاذة أديبة بوسفيحة من كلية أدب سايس, الأستاذ ما نساولكش الأستاذ ديالك الصديق العزيز يوسف بن عبد الرازق, الصديق العزيز طيب غردو, الأستاذة كروم من جامعة محمد الخامس بالرباط, سعد الدين أخجام, سي مساوي, and اعذروني, I apologize, I mean, كاين شي حد السي طيب, and Professor Slawi, our wonderful coordinator.
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Mubtasim, although he's not here today, but he has always supported us.
We apologize for
Professor Ben Dawood Nadif.
Professor Ben Dawood Nadif, Professor Botahar or Tahar.
Professor Kinza Sadani is here.
Professor Kinza Sadani, your name is at the top of the list. Imagine وقعت فكرت بن عبد الرازق, خفت ندير الفالطة مع السي امين, صدقت غادي نعور راسي بيدي وغادي ندير الفالطة معك.
سي مكي, سي مكي, سي مكي.
And by the way, by the way, Professor Sadani is a member of the master program and she's doing great job. Yes, you know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
They are very happy with you. Yes, and we share the discipline. Yes, she teaches applied linguistics, and I know she teaches research methodology.
Yeah.
And we are the same generation.
Yeah.
فاش كان مازال بديوها فيها 4 سنين و3 سنين ياك استاذ السعداني؟
عامين استاذ عامين.
عامين ايوا كان عامين ولكن ماشي كلشي دوز فيها عامين راه بزاف اللي ساكن في محنو. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your great efforts.
Tomorrow, inshallah, we have another friend, another wonderful guest, Sidi Abdelmajid Bouzian. Everyone knows him, and our friend and colleague, Sada Karima Bilghis, on assessment in general and online assessment in particular. I hope, Professor Oudghiri, I hope your commitments would allow you to attend with us. Because
yes,
you give us 15 minutes, 1 minute, 2, 3. We hear your voice, and then you can go to.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. I will do my best because we have a couple of big projects here, plus the Advocacy and Policy Summit in Washington that's coming up. So I may need to tune out for a couple of weeks, but inshallah, I'll do my best.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Simki, our PhD student, who is an example of a student leader, indeed. He has invested great time, energy for the best of his friends. Thank you very much, Simki.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Oudghiri, for the outstanding lectures from which we learned a lot as professors, and also our students learned a lot from you and enjoyed all the discussions and the information you presented. Thank you very much, Mr. Ayoub and Manal, for the excellent presentations. We are very proud of you and wish you good luck with the rest. Thank you, Mr. Mki, a wonderful student.
Thank you so much, madam.
Good job.
Professor Slawi, I'm afraid I might have forgotten my friend, Professor Madani, who is always joining our efforts. I'm afraid. My mem. Okay, it's the end of the day.
And Professor Sandy.
And Professor Sandy, thank you very much. And Professor Hakim, all professors, those who are present and those who are doing something else somewhere for the best of our students somewhere else in Morocco and worldwide. Thank you all those who are doing something for the best of humankind at this very difficult moment.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor. We really benefited a lot.
Great efforts to join us and to meet together. Those,
okay.
Yes, sir.
The floor is yours. You can close. You can open the discussion with your friends. Once again, I will leave the room and close the door.
Yeah, I just want to ask to thank Professor Aminu Drury for his insightful presentations, and